Wade Coulter cried on a Tuesday morning in October. Not because he was sad. The sky had gone red over the snow, deep red, the kind that burns at the edges before it fades. He had seen that sky 100 times from that same ridge, 100 mornings, maybe more, and every single one of them had been enough. That morning, it was not enough. He sat there for a long time after the color left, sat with his coffee going cold in his hand, and the wind moving through the timber below him, and the silence that he had spent 9 years building around himself like a wall. The silence was still there. It just did not feel the same. He could not have told you what changed. There was no single thing, no event, no sign from the mountain or the sky or the animal trails. He read like other men read newspapers. There was only the red sky and the feeling that came with it, the feeling of a room where something used to be. He drank the cold coffee anyway, stood up, kicked dirt over the fire. He looked at Biscuit, his mule, who was standing 20 feet away, eating dead grass with the focused commitment of a creature that had never once wasted energy on feelings. Wade started breaking camp. He had planned to stay through mid-November. The snowpack had come in hard but manageable. His shelter was solid. His stores were good. He had 3 more weeks of clean work ahead of him and no reason to cut it short. He cut it short anyway. He told himself it was the weather. The pressure had been shifting for 2 days. He told himself a man alone at elevation with a season of pelts and a mule had no business waiting to find out how bad it intended to get. He believed that for about 4 miles down the switchback trail. Then he stopped believing it. The truth was simpler and considerably more uncomfortable. For the first time in 9 years, the silence had stopped being a companion and started being a presence. Like something standing behind him that was not there when he turned around. He had been alone on that mountain by choice, every season, every winter. He had gone up after Clara died, and he had not come all the way back down since, not in any way that counted. Clara. He had a habit with her name. He did not say it out loud. He did not think it directly if he could help it. He approached it sideways, the way you approach a fire that is still too hot to stand next to. You know it is there. You feel the heat from a distance. You do not put your hands in. In his inside coat pocket there was a small button. Blue. The color had faded at the edges from 9 years of being carried. It was the button Clara had been holding when she told him not to be sad, when she said she was only going ahead. He had not cried then either. He had gone up the mountain instead. Wade led Biscuit down through the lodgepole pines and tried not to think about what he was actually doing, which was going back to the world of people for reasons he could not name and did not want to examine too closely. What he knew about Clara's death. He knew the way a man knows a verdict he has read too many times to dispute anymore. He had brought her to that country. He had chosen that life for them. She had died in a timber cabin in January with no doctor within 2 days' ride and a storm that made the road impossible. The baby, a boy, had not survived the night. Wade was the reason she was there. That was the verdict. He had written it himself and read it every day for 9 years until it became the same as fact. He did not know, riding down through the pines with Biscuit's hooves quiet in the snow, that there was a woman in Rawlins who had been waiting 9 years to tell him something Clara had said. A woman named Ruth Mackay, who had been the only other person in that cabin, who had held Clara's hand, who had listened when Clara, in the last clear minutes she had said something meant for Wade. Ruth had kept it. She had kept it the way you keep something that belongs to someone else, carefully, without using it, waiting for the person it was meant for to come and collect it. Wade did not know about Ruth Mackay. He had never asked. He had never gone back to Rawlins after that winter. He had never looked for the woman who had been there. He had not thought he deserved to hear anything that might make it easier. That was also a choice. He had just never called it by its right name. Harrow's Gulch announced itself the way all half-dead things do. First the smell of coal smoke on the wind, then the sound of the stamp mill working somewhere to the north, its rhythm dull and mechanical and indifferent to everything. Then the dark shapes of buildings against the pale winter sky close together like men trying to stay warm. The main street was a long corridor of frozen mud. The ruts were deep enough to break an ankle in if you were not watching your feet. Wade was always watching his feet. 9 years on mountain terrain had made that automatic. The storefronts had the look of buildings put up in a hurry by people who intended to make their fortune and leave. Most of them had done exactly that. Paint peeled off false fronts. A hotel sign swung on one hinge. There was a general store, a land office that looked like it shared space with a saloon, and at the far end of the main block, a livery that appeared to be the most solid structure in town. Wade watched a group of men come out of the saloon as he walked Biscuit up the street. They stood on the boardwalk and looked at him with the particular expression of men who have nothing pressing to do and consider the arrival of a stranger to be the most interesting thing that has happened all afternoon. Nobody offered to help when Biscuit's front left hoof broke through a crust of ice covering a frozen rut, and the mule stumbled hard to the right. The pack frame shifted. 2 of the hide bundles came loose. Wade had to stop in the middle of the street and spend 5 cold minutes in the wind, relashing the load, while Biscuit expressed his feelings about the situation by standing as still as possible and staring straight ahead with the stoic dignity of an animal that has made peace with the fact that indignity is the natural condition of working life. He did not expect the men to help. He noted the fact the same way he noted most things, as information about the nature of the place. He settled Biscuit at the livery, paid for 2 nights of feed, and a dry stall left the season's hides under the liveryman's supervision, and took his saddlebags with his gold dust and his most important papers, and walked back out into the cold. His left boot caught on something under the ice near the mouth of an alley. A piece of old wagon hardware, a leaf spring maybe that had worked its way up through the freeze-thaw until it was just below the surface of the mud. He felt the bite of it before he saw it. The iron caught the welt of his boot on the outside edge of the sole and tore a gash 4 inches long through the stitching. Not quite separating the sole from the upper, but close enough that he could feel cold seeping in through the gap with every step. He looked down at the damage. He looked up at the street. The liveryman, when Wade asked, said there was only one leather shop in town at the far end of the main block past the general store, and gestured vaguely in that direction. He added without being asked that the proprietor was a woman, and that some people had opinions about that. Wade did not ask what opinions those were. He already had a picture of the town. He found the shop at the end of a row of buildings that had seen better years. A low storefront with a heavy plank door and 2 small windows, both of them lit from inside by the warm yellow of kerosene lamps. The sign above the door was new wood on an old frame. Pruitt Leather Works. Below that, in smaller letters, established 1874. No other explanation offered. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him before anything else. Rawhide and neatsfoot oil and beeswax and the particular sharp sweetness of leather dye that is soaked into wooden walls over years. It was the smell of serious work done consistently in one place for a long time. The smell of something real. The front room was crowded, but organized. Not the organization of someone who wanted the room to look organized, but the organization of someone who actually worked in it. Tools hung on the walls in arrangements that made sense only if you understood what they were for and in what order they were used. Finished pieces hung on a rack to the right. A saddle. 2 sets of harness. A rifle scabbard with tooled scrollwork along the spine that Wade looked at longer than he intended to. Half-finished work sat in wooden frames on a bench along the left wall. Behind the main counter at a heavy oak workbench in the back of the room, a woman was working. Wade stopped just inside the door and took her in the way he took in any new terrain. Without hurry, without expectation. Noting what was there rather than what he thought he would find. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders and full through the body in a way that spoke of physical work done consistently over many years. She moved within the small space of the shop with an economy that said she had always known exactly where she was in it and had never felt the need to apologize for taking up her share of the room. He looked at her hands first. He always looked at hands first with people he did not know. Hands told you almost everything worth knowing. Her hands were large and scarred and stained deep purple to the second knuckle from leather dye. She wore a heavy canvas apron over a dark wool dress, and her black hair was pulled back in a bun that had started the day neat and had been coming undone ever since. A few strands clung to the side of her face where she had been working close over the bench. She was using a curved awl to punch a line of holes through a doubled piece of harness leather, and she was doing it with the kind of focused, unhurried authority that comes from having performed an action so many thousands of times that the body does it partly without being asked. Her weight was behind the awl. Her breathing was steady and controlled. She finished the hole she was working on, rotated the leather a precise distance, and began the next one. She did not look up when he came in. He said his boot was torn, caught a wagon iron in the street. She still did not look up immediately. She finished her hole, set the awl down on the bench with a small, deliberate sound. Then she turned and looked at him. Her eyes were a dark amber brown, clear and direct with no particular warmth in them, but no hostility either. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they are being asked to assess. Without drama, without performance, with simple, total attention. Her gaze went to his face for one brief moment and then dropped to his feet. She looked at the left boot for 3 seconds, maybe 4. 70 cents, she said, done before the weather turns. She said it the way a person states a fact that does not require discussion. He said that was all right. She came around the counter and gestured at the wooden chair beside the iron stove in the corner of the room. He sat. He removed the left boot and handed it to her. She took it in both hands and turned it slowly, running her thumb along the gash in the welt, testing the stitching that remained, checking the thickness of the sole. Her expression did not change. She turned the boot over and looked at the bottom, checking the heel and the toe and the whole structural condition of the thing beyond the immediate damage. She nodded once to herself. Then she looked up, and she did not look at his face. She looked at his left hand. She said the injury had been there a long time. He stopped. He had not mentioned his hand to anyone. He had not thought there was anything visible about it. He carried it the way he had carried it for 7 years, which was the way he had learned to carry it after the grisly encounter that had left the tendons in his palm damaged and the cold always finding the weakness in the scar tissue. She said she could tell by the way he had taken the boot from her, using the full palm instead of the fingers. People do that, she said, when the fingers do not close all the way. 7 years, he said. She nodded, carried the boot to her bench, selected a curved awl of a different size from the wall, a spool of double-waxed sinew, a small bone-handled tool he recognized as a stitching groover. She clamped the boot into a wooden vise mounted at the edge of the bench, settled herself on her stool, and began. Wade sat beside the stove and let the warmth work into his hands, which had been cold for 3 weeks, and he watched her work. He had been in the company of skilled people before. He had known an old French-Canadian trapper named Beaumont who could read animal sign on hard ground that looked to everyone else like bare rock. He had known a Shoshone woman in the Wind River country who could tan a hide to the consistency of velvet using nothing but the animal's own brains and a smooth stone. He knew what genuine skill looked like from years of living in places where competence was the difference between alive and not. The woman in the leather shop had it. The awl went through the leather in a clean, controlled stroke. The sinew followed, pulling tight with a sound that was almost musical in its consistency. She was not rushing. She was not performing. She was simply doing a thing she knew how to do with the full weight of her attention and the full strength of her hands. And the rhythm of it filled the small room the way the ticking of a good clock fills a room. Not loudly, but with a kind of steady authority that makes everything else feel less urgent. Outside, the wind had picked up. It pressed against the small windows and found the gaps around the door frame and made the kerosene flames bend slightly in their glass chimneys. The temperature was dropping fast. Wade could feel it even through the walls. He was aware, sitting in that chair by that stove, of something he had not felt in a long time. He was in a room with another person, and he did not feel the urge to leave it. That was all it was. That was the whole of it. But he noticed it the way you notice a pain stopping, by the absence where something had been. After perhaps 40 minutes, she set down the awl. She ran the bone groover along the new seam, pressing the sinew into the groove so it sat below the surface of the leather, protected from abrasion. She applied a coat of dark oil along the welt with a small brush, working it into the new stitches and the old leather around them. Then she stood up and brought the boot to him. He took it and turned it in the lamplight. The gash was gone. In its place was a line of stitching so tight and even it looked machine-made, except that no machine could have countersunk the thread into a groove like that flush with the surface so that nothing would catch on rock or root or ice. She had reinforced the inside of the welt as well. He could feel the thin rawhide patch she had glued and stitched across the damaged area harder than the original material. He pulled the boot on, laced it up, stood and walked 4 paces toward the door and back. It was better than it had been before it was damaged. He was certain of that. He looked at her. She was already back at the bench, back to the harness leather she had been working when he came in. He said that she had countersunk the thread. She glanced back at him over her shoulder. He said not many leather workers bother with that. It was extra time. Most figured the thread would hold on the surface. She looked at him for a moment with that same assessing attention. Then she turned back to her work. 70 cents, she said. He put 70 cents on the counter. Her back was to him. He walked out into the cold. He was halfway to the hotel when he stopped walking. He had not meant to stop. He stopped anyway. He stood in the middle of the frozen street and thought about what he had just done, which was pay for a service without argument, without calculation, without any particular motive he could name. He thought about the 40 minutes by the stove. He thought about not wanting to leave. He had spent 9 years on a mountain making himself need nothing. He had been good at it, better than most. And here in a cold town he had planned to pass through in 48 hours, he had sat in a stranger's shop for 40 minutes, feeling something he had not been able to feel in 9 years, which was simply present. He stood there a while longer. Then he walked to the hotel and told himself he was not thinking about it. That was also a lie, and some part of him knew it. He took a corner table at a saloon called the Miners' Exchange that evening, as far from the bar as the room allowed, and ordered a whiskey he intended to make last. The saloon was not crowded, but it was occupied in the particular way of mining town saloons in winter. Men who had worked hard all summer, spending the proceeds with the focused efficiency of people who know exactly how much they have to get through before spring. The noise level was steady and unremarkable. Nobody paid Wade any attention, which was how he preferred it. He was on his second whiskey, watching the door out of habit, when 2 men sat down at the table next to his. They were not talking to him and had no apparent awareness of him. One was a thick man in his 40s with the destroyed hands of a man who had spent years working underground. The other was younger, maybe 30, with a beard that suggested he had been meaning to deal with it for several weeks. They had the easy, slightly mournful manner of men who have been working together long enough that they no longer need to impress each other. Wade was not trying to overhear. He simply did not look away or cover his ears, which amounted to the same thing in a room where 2 men were talking at normal volume 6 feet away. The older man said something about a family named Turner. Wade knew the name vaguely, in the way you know names in a town you have passed through before. The Turners had run something on the north end of the street, a blacksmith operation maybe. The younger man said they were gone, sold out last week and left on the Tuesday stage to Cheyenne. That was the 3rd business this year, the older man said. Turner, the younger one, said. Then the Hendrickses, then the Okafors. All of them on land, somebody wanted, the older man said. Somebody being vain. A pause. The older man drank. Who is next? The younger one asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Leather shop, the older man said. The Pruitt woman is on a good corner lot. Vane has been patient with her. That patience won't last much longer. The younger man shook his head slowly. That woman never did anything to anybody. Doesn't matter, the older man said. And the flatness in his voice when he said it was the flatness of a man who has accepted an unpleasant truth and adjusted his expectations accordingly. They moved to other subjects. Wade sat with his whiskey glass and said nothing and looked at nothing in particular. He thought about the countersunk stitching. He thought about 70 cents on a counter. He thought about the way the lamplight had looked in that small room, warm and steady against the cold outside. He thought about the woman who had read 7 years of injury in his hand from the way he held a boot and had not made a single unnecessary comment about it. He thought about 2 men deciding what was going to happen to her without having any apparent sense that she was a person whose preferences on the matter were relevant. He picked up his glass, set it back down without drinking. He stayed in the saloon for a while longer, watching the door and thinking about nothing in particular, which was what he told himself he was doing. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. He could feel it in the way the window glass had gone completely opaque with frost, and in the way the men who came in from outside moved directly toward the stove without stopping to talk to anyone first. He thought about going back to the hotel. He did not go back to the hotel. He thought about the leather shop and the lamp burning in the window, and the woman who had been working when he arrived, and who he had no doubt was still working now long after most of the businesses on the street had closed for the night. He thought about what the man had said about the corner lot, about patience having limits. He ordered a 3rd whiskey, which he had not intended to do. He drank half of it slowly, and then set the glass down and looked at the frosted window for a while. He had no business in this town past collecting a few supplies and selling the season's pelts. He had no connection to the woman in the leather shop beyond a torn boot and 70 cents and 40 minutes beside a stove. He had come down from the mountains 6 weeks early for reasons he still had not examined directly. He had plans, such as they were. Rawlins, maybe Laramie, somewhere to winter among people he was comfortable ignoring. Harrow's Gulch was not that place. He knew that. And he sat in the saloon anyway, turning the half-empty whiskey glass in his hands and listening to the stamp mill working somewhere to the north, distant and mechanical and indifferent to everything happening inside this room. The thing about a man who has spent 9 years alone on a mountain is that he becomes very good at sitting with discomfort without reaching for anything to make it stop. That is what the mountain teaches you more than anything else. How to stay still when staying still is what the situation requires. How to wait without knowing what you are waiting for. Wade sat still. He did not know what he was waiting for. He walked back to the hotel when the saloon began emptying out around midnight. The street was absolutely silent. The cold had settled in hard and the frozen mud was solid underfoot. His breath made small clouds in the air. The boot held. No seepage, no give. Just solid contact with the ground step after step. He looked at the far end of the street as he walked. The lamp was still burning in the windows of Pruitt Leatherworks. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. A small yellow rectangle against the dark. The only light left on the street at that hour. He had always had a habit of checking the weather before he slept. Reading the sky, the temperature, the direction of the wind, information about what the next day would bring. He had never had a habit of checking the lights in other people's windows. He started having one now. He went to the hotel. He took a room. He lay on a bed that was softer than anything he had slept on in 3 months and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was the lie he told himself most often. His hand was in his inside pocket without him deciding to put it there. His fingers found the small button. Blue. Worn at the edges. Clara had said she was only going ahead. He had not known what to do with that then. He still did not know. For 9 years he had folded it up along with everything else and carried it on the mountain where it could not do any damage to anyone. But here he was in a hotel in Harrow's Gulch with the cold pressing against the window glass and the town quiet outside and the stamp mill finally silent for the night. And the thought that arrived in the stillness, the one he could not fold up or carry off, was this. He had gotten very good at carrying things alone. He was no longer certain that was the same as strength. He put the button back in his pocket. He closed his eyes. Before he slept, one thought moved through him the way water moves under ice, quiet and certain. He was going to stay in Harrow's Gulch for the winter. He did not examine this decision any more carefully than he had examined his reason for coming down from the mountains 6 weeks early. Some things you accept as true before you understand why they are true. In the morning he would sell the season's pelts. He would arrange a weekly rate for Biscuit's stall. He would buy coffee and salt and oats and ammunition. He would do all the practical things a man does when he is settling into a place. And then, because his right boot needed a new lining, and because that was a legitimate errand and not any other kind, he would walk back down to the end of the street and push open the door of Pruitt Leatherworks. That was what he told himself. Biscuit was in the livery at the other end of town, presumably asleep, indifferent to the whole question of what Wade intended or did not intend. The old mule had the gift of uncomplicated rest that came from having no illusions about the world and no ambitions beyond good hay and a dry stall. Wade had always envied that quality in the animal. He was beginning to think he had been pursuing the wrong version of the same thing, that somewhere along the way he had confused the peace of needing nothing with the peace of having nothing left to lose, and that those were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was exactly the size of the hollow place he had been carrying for 9 years without letting himself name it. He slept. The cold came in hard the next morning and stayed. Wade was at the livery before first light, checking on Biscuit, running his hands along the mule's legs, the way he always did after a difficult trail day, feeling for heat or swelling that would tell him something was wrong. There was nothing wrong. Biscuit accepted the inspection with the dignified patience of an animal that has long since made peace with the fact that the humans in his life will periodically touch him for reasons he does not fully understand, but has learned to tolerate. Wade combed ice from the mule's tail, checked the water bucket, checked the hay. He sold the season's pelts at the trading post before 8 in the morning. The buyer tried to underpay him and found after a short, quiet conversation that Wade was not the kind of man who could be underpaid through persistence. He arranged a weekly rate at the livery. He had his gold dust assayed and deposited in the Harrows Gulch branch of the Laramie Territorial Bank, a small institution operating out of a room at the back of the general store, but which had the appropriate federal charter and was as trustworthy as most. He bought coffee, salt, oats, dried beans, ammunition, a new tin plate to replace the one he had cracked on the trail down. He did all of this before noon. Then he stood on the boardwalk outside the general store and looked down the length of the main street toward the far end, where the sign above the leather shop door said, "Pruitt Leather Works," in plain letters, and the two small windows showed the warm yellow of kerosene lamps burning inside. His right boot needed a new lining. That was a legitimate errand. He walked down the street. She was already working when he pushed the door open. He had expected that. He was beginning to suspect she was always already working, that the working was not something she started and stopped, so much as something she inhabited the way other people inhabited their own skin. She looked up when he came in. There was a brief moment, half a second at most, where something moved across her face that was not quite surprise, because she did not seem like a woman who was surprised by much, but was something adjacent to it. A recalibration. Then it was gone, and she was simply looking at him again with that clear, direct gaze that took in information without announcing what it was doing. He told her about the right boot lining. She looked at the boot still on his foot and named a price and a time and went back to what she was doing. He sat in the chair by the stove because she had not told him not to, and because it was warm and because he had nowhere else to be that mattered more than here. He was there for perhaps half an hour. He did not examine this. He simply sat. The fire in the stove breathed steadily. The awl moved through leather in its clean, controlled rhythm. The sinew pulled tight. Outside, the wind worked at the windows. Inside, the smell of beeswax and raw hide and honest labor had soaked into the walls over years and years until the room itself carried it the way old timber carries the smell of the forest it came from. He left when she told him the lining would be ready in 2 days. He came back the following morning with a length of bur oak he had cut from a fallen tree he found at the edge of town, wood that would burn hot and clean without the creosote that lesser wood deposited in stovepipes. He stacked it beside the front door before the shop opened and walked away without knocking. He did not tell her he had left it. She would see it when she opened up. He came back the afternoon of that day for the boot lining which she had finished. He came back the day after that with no particular reason, but found one when he arrived. The hinge on her back door was working loose from the frame. He could see it from the main room when she went through to check on something in the back. He borrowed a screwdriver from the livery and came back and tightened it. The job took 11 minutes and required nothing more than his presence and a basic mechanical aptitude. The tread board at the entrance had a loose nail that made it catch on the bottom of the door. He fixed that too. The caulking around the left window frame had cracked and dried out over the summer, and winter air was finding the gap. He came back with a small pot of wood putty from the hardware store and filled it. None of these things were discussed. None of them were acknowledged directly. They were simply done the way necessary things in a working environment get done when someone who notices them also has the ability to address them. On the 4th morning, he arrived to find the cot of coffee on the corner of the counter. She was in the back of the shop working. He had not asked for coffee. She had not said anything about coffee. It was simply there, still hot, which told him she had heard his footsteps on the frozen boardwalk outside and had poured it in the interval between hearing him coming and the door opening. He picked up the cup, used his full palm around it the way he always did when the cold had gotten into his hand. He drank it standing at the counter. Neither of them said anything about it. This was how the arrangement worked. No discussion, no declaration. The cord of bur oak beside the door every few days. The cot of coffee on the corner of the counter. The repairs that needed doing done. The presence of the chair by the stove available and never explicitly offered. It was a language that neither of them had invented and neither of them had named, and both of them understood without needing to. On the 7th day, a woman came into the shop while Wade was sitting by the stove. She was older, wearing a wool coat with a fur collar, and she had the particular manner of a person who has decided that her opinions constitute a form of community service. She bought a length of latigo strap from the shelf rack, paid for it, turned to leave, then paused in the way that people pause when they have been planning to say something all along and have finally given themselves permission. "Nora," she said, using the shortened name with the familiarity of someone who has not earned it. She said it the way a person announces that what is coming next is helpful. "You should know that people are talking about that man who was here the other evening. Staying late, a woman alone. You know how it looks." She did not glance at Wade, which meant she was very aware of him. Nora Pruitt did not stop what she was doing. She finished the stitch she was working on, tied it off, and set it down with the deliberate patience of a person who refuses to let another person's urgency become their own. Then she looked at the woman. "Mrs. Harmon," she said, "you came in with $1.20. You owe me 3 cents change." She reached into the cash box and placed 3 cents on the counter. "Thank you for the business," she said. Mrs. Harmon took the 3 cents with the expression of a person who has been handled more expertly than she anticipated and left. The door closed. Outside, someone was driving a wagon down the frozen street, the iron wheels shrieking against the ice. A dog barked somewhere and then stopped. Wade did not say anything for a while. Then he said she had not argued with her. Nora glanced up from her work. "Arguing takes energy," she said. She went back to what she was doing. Wade sat by the stove and watched her work and did not say anything else. And in that silence he felt something settling in him, some agitation or restlessness that he had been carrying since he came down from the mountain, quieting the way a fire quiets when the wind stops feeding it. He did not know what to do with this information. He sat with it and let it be what it was. On the 14th day, he came into the shop in the mid-afternoon and found Nora in the back room, attempting to move a bale of heavy salt-cured hides that had come in that morning from a rancher north of town. The hides were stacked 3 high on a wooden pallet, and the combined weight was somewhere in the neighborhood of 240 pounds. He estimated that in the moment he came through the door, because he had moved enough hides in his life to judge the weight by the size and condition and the way they sat on the wood. She had gotten the pallet 6 inches off the floor by working a wooden lever underneath it, and was in the process of trying to move it sideways onto a lower shelf where it could be accessed more easily. The problem was physics. The lever gave her the lift, but not the lateral movement, and the weight was at an angle that wanted to come down on the wrong side. She was compensating with her back in a way that would hurt her if she held it another 30 seconds. Wade came through the back doorway without announcing himself. He put his hands under the forward edge of the pallet and lifted. He did not say anything. She did not flinch or protest. She simply recalibrated to the new situation, shifted her grip and her angle, and together they moved the pallet onto the lower shelf in one smooth motion that took about 8 seconds. He stepped back. She straightened up. She put one hand briefly on the edge of the shelf, not leaning on it, just touching it. A small private acknowledgement of the effort that had just been made. And that was when he saw it. Her left sleeve had ridden up as she straightened, and the cuff of her wool dress had fallen back from her wrist. On the inside of her left forearm near the wrist there was a scar. It was old and fully healed. The skin was pale and slightly raised in a line that was perhaps 3 inches long, running along the inside of the forearm. It was not the kind of scar that came from a leather tool or a burning brand or any of the common accidents of the work she did. He knew what those looked like. He had them on his own hands. He knew what this kind of scar looked like too. He had been in enough hard places and seen enough people in them to know. He looked away immediately and completely. He looked at the hides on the shelf. He looked at the low shelf itself. He looked at a spot on the wall where someone years ago had written a measurement in pencil, and the pencil mark was still there, faded but legible, some dimension of something he would never know the purpose of. Nora pulled her sleeve down and did not look at him and went back to the main room. He stood in the back room for a moment longer, then he followed her out. He sat in the chair by the stove and did not say anything about what he had seen, because there was nothing he could say about it that would not be wrong. The best thing he could do, the only thing, was to be exactly what he had been. A person in the room who did not need her to be anything other than what she was. She settled onto her stool. He heard the small sound of the vise being adjusted. He heard the work begin again. He stayed until the light outside had fully gone. On the 15th morning there was something new on the stool beside his usual chair. A small glass jar, heavy-walled, sealed with a circle of oilcloth and a twist of wire. Inside was a thick, pale compound he recognized immediately. Bear fat mixed with something herbal. The kind of preparation his mother had made from a recipe she had gotten from a Sioux woman she had traded with when Wade was a boy. He had used it himself years back when his hand injury was new. It had worked better than anything the doctor in Lander had given him. He picked up the jar. He looked toward the back of the shop. She was already at the bench, already working, already doing the way she always was. He opened the jar. He used it. He put it in his coat pocket for later. He did not thank her with words because she had not offered it with words, and they had, without discussing it, arrived at an understanding about the ratio of work to other things in this particular space. 3 weeks passed in Harrow's Gulch, the way deep winter always passes in that part of Wyoming. Not day by day, but in long, unbroken stretches of cold and work, and the particular stillness that settles over a place when the temperature drops low enough that even sound seems reluctant to travel. The stamp mill at the north end of town ran in the mornings and went quiet in the afternoons. The saloons opened at noon and stayed open until the last man capable of walking home had done so. The street froze harder every night and thawed not at all. The drifts against the north-facing walls along the main block reached 5 feet by the end of the 3rd week. Through all of it, the lamp burned in the windows of Pruitt Leatherworks. She did not miss a day. He knew this because he checked every morning when he came down from the hotel and every evening when he came back. The light was always there. The work was always underway. He brought wood. She left coffee. He fixed things that needed fixing. She made things that needed making. The town observed this arrangement with the mixture of puzzlement and quiet disapproval that attends any arrangement it cannot categorize, and neither of them paid the town's observations any particular attention. He had developed a habit he had not decided to develop, which was looking at the windows of the leather shop when he passed along the street at any hour, checking for the lamp. It was always there until late. Sometimes it was there when he came down the street before first light. He did not examine this habit. What he did not know and would not know for some time was that Nora Pruitt had developed a corresponding habit of her own. She knew the sound of his boots on the frozen boardwalk outside. She had identified them within the first week from the weight and rhythm of the step, heavier than most, more deliberate a man who walked with his full weight on the ground rather than on the balls of his feet. When she heard them approaching, she did not look up. But something in the set of her shoulders changed by a degree so small that no one who did not know what to look for would have noticed it. He had not yet earned the right to know that, and she had not yet decided whether he ever would. On the 20th day, the legal notice arrived. Wade did not know about it until that evening when he came into the shop in the late afternoon and found Nora in the back room sitting on the low stool in the corner, the one she used when she was fitting a tall piece of work. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand, and she was looking at it with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not grief exactly, not anger. Something in between the two, a tightly controlled version of both, the face of a person who has received news they expected and have not yet decided how to respond to it. She heard him come in and looked up. Her expression shifted very slightly from whatever private place it had been toward the more neutral territory she normally showed the world. She held the paper out to him. He came forward and took it. He read it through twice before he trusted his understanding of it. Then he read it a 3rd time. Vane Commercial Holdings, a Wyoming Territory partnership, had purchased from the original creditor a debt belonging to the estate of Thomas Pruitt, deceased, in the amount of $212.60, representing principal and outstanding interest on a commercial equipment loan originally issued by the First Territorial Bank of Laramie in the year 1875. The debt was now in arrears. The property at lots 14 and 15 Block C Harrow's Gulchtown survey, which had been offered as collateral at the time of the original loan, was subject to foreclosure proceedings if the balance was not paid within 30 days of the notice date. The notice was dated 10 days ago. He looked up from the paper. 20 days, he said. She nodded. He thought about what he knew of debts like this one. The language was too specific to be fabricated. The loan particulars, too, detailed the legal description of the collateral property too precise to be invented. Thomas Pruitt had borrowed money for equipment in 1875, which was exactly what a craftsman opening a new shop in a frontier town might do. He had made payments. The records would show that. But in the way of small loans in the territories where banking was informal and record-keeping inconsistent, and a man who had died of lung disease in the spring of 1878 had larger concerns in his final months than tracking down a Laramie bank to settle a residual interest balance, something had been left outstanding, and someone had found it. He set the paper on the shelf beside him. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with that clear, direct, unwavering gaze, and he could see in it the calculation she was doing, the inventory of her resources, the measurement of the gap between what she had and what was required. $212, he said. She said nothing. He had that money. He had more than that money. He had it in the bank 3 buildings down the street, and he could have it in her hand within an hour if she would take it. He knew before he considered the matter further that she would not take it. Not as a gift. Possibly not as a loan. She was not built for accepting things she had not earned, and he understood that not as a judgment but as a fact about her, the same way the weight of the hide bales was a fact and the temperature outside was a fact. He needed to think. He told her he would be back in the morning. She picked up the legal notice, folded it, put it in her apron pocket, stood up and went back to the main room and sat down at her bench and picked up the awl. He watched her do this from the doorway. Then he left. He went to the one place in Harrow's Gulch where men talked without filtering themselves, which was the back corner of the Miners' Exchange before the working day started, when the night shift men from the stamp mill came in for a last drink before going home to sleep and were tired enough to say things they would not say at other hours. He sat there the following morning with a single cup of coffee and listened. He learned 3 things. The first was that the Vane silver mine, which had been the original economic engine of Harrow's Gulch and the source of the Vane family's considerable standing in the territory, was not performing the way it once had. The vein had been thinning for 2 years. The old-timers on the night shift talked about it the way men talk about a patient they have given up on, with the flat pragmatism of people who have accepted the diagnosis and are waiting for the outcome. The second was that Cornelia Vane, a name Wade had not heard before that he filed away carefully, had been making trips to Cheyenne with some frequency over the past year. Trips that involved meetings with banking representatives and men from the Territorial Land Office. The old-timer who shared this did not know the purpose of these meetings, but he knew they had happened, and he knew they cost money that Cornelia Vane appeared willing to spend. The third thing came from a younger man, a day-shift foreman who mentioned in passing that the Vane mine property included surface rights over a considerable area of the gulch. Rights that had never been fully exercised because the underground operation had always been sufficient. But in the event of a new surveying of the town site which was being discussed in Cheyenne, those surface rights might have a value that had nothing to do with what was underground. Wade drank his coffee and added these pieces to what he already knew and looked at the picture they made together. The mine was dying. Cornelia Vane knew it. She had known it for at least 2 years. She was looking for a way to convert one kind of asset into another. Corner lots in a town site that was about to be resurveyed. Land with clear title. Property she could consolidate under her own name or the name of a holding company and leverage against the future value of a resurveyed town claim. The leather shop sat on one of the better corner lots on the main street. The legal description in the foreclosure notice was precise about that. He paid for his coffee and walked in the cold to the building that contained the Harrow's Gulch branch of Vane Commercial Holdings, which operated with the particular transparency of an operation confident in its own authority out of a storefront 2 doors down from the hotel. The name was on the sign. He went in. The interior was arranged as a business office. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a small potbelly stove. A young man with clean hands sat at the desk and looked up when Wade came in with an expression that tried to be welcoming and did not quite succeed. Wade said he wanted to speak with Mrs. Vane. The young man said Mrs. Vane did not generally receive unannounced visitors. Wade said he would wait. He sat in one of the chairs, and sat in it with the settled quality of a large man who has slept on the ground in freezing weather and in consequence does not find chairs to be a significant discomfort and has no particular concern about how long he sits in them. The young man looked at him for a moment and then went through a door at the back of the room. Cornelia Vane came out 12 minutes later. She was not what he had constructed in his imagination. He had expected someone theatrical. She was not theatrical. She was a woman in her mid-50s in a good wool dress. iron gray hair pinned neatly, and the composed, measuring expression of someone who had spent decades in the company of people who wanted things from her and had developed an efficient method of assessing what they wanted and whether it was worth her time. She sat behind the desk and looked at him. "Mr. Coulter," she said. She knew his name. He had expected that. "I understand you have been spending time at the Pruitt property," she said. He said he wanted to discuss the debt notice. She folded her hands on the desk. "It is a straightforward matter," she said. "Thomas Pruitt borrowed money and left a balance outstanding. The debt is legal and documented." "I know," he said. "I am not here to dispute it." She looked at him with increased attention. He said he was there because he wanted to understand what she actually wanted. Not the lot, not the legal mechanism, what she wanted. She was quiet for a moment. This was not what she had anticipated. People who came to dispute legal notices came with arguments. People who came asking what she wanted came with something to offer. "I have a mine," she said. "Finally, that requires capital investment to reach a new vein. The existing operation is insufficient to service the level of investment required. A credible outside investor, someone whose name would satisfy a Cheyenne bank's due diligence requirement, would allow me to arrange the financing I need." In exchange for what he said. The debt notice goes away. The girl keeps her lot. She paused. "And you put your name on a statement confirming that you have examined the mine's operation and consider it a sound investment." He looked at her. He looked at the document she had removed from the desk drawer and placed in front of him while she was speaking. A single page dense with legal language, the kind of language that a man without legal training reads and believes he understands and frequently does not. He read it. He read it carefully twice the way he read any document before he signed it, which was a habit he had formed young and maintained through all the years on the mountain. The language was as she had described, a statement of investment interest, an attestation of the mine's operational soundness. It was formal, and it used terminology that he understood in its general contours but not in every specific application. What he did not see, because it was in paragraph 4, subsection C, embedded in a clause that referenced the Wyoming Territory Commercial Attestation Act of 1872, was the phrase that said in effect that by signing he was confirming the mine was currently operating at sufficient capacity to service a debt of $40,000 over a period of 3 years. He had not seen the mine. He did not know if that statement was true. He sat with the document for a long moment. He thought about the lamp in the window every morning. Every evening. He signed it. Cornelia countersigned. The debt notice was canceled before noon. He walked out into the cold with the receipt for the transaction in his coat pocket and the feeling of a man who has solved a problem and is not entirely certain at what cost. He went to the leather shop. He put the receipt on the counter without comment. Nora looked at it, read it again, then looked up at him. "How?" she said. It was not a question exactly, it was an accounting request. She wanted to know what had been spent. He told her straightforwardly without embellishment or apology. He told her about the commercial attestation document and what it said and what he had signed. She listened to all of it without moving, without changing her expression, without any of the reactions he had braced himself for. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you seen the mine?" "No." "Do you know anyone who has seen it recently?" "No." "Then you signed a document attesting to the condition of something you have never seen." He looked at the canceled notice still sitting on the counter. She said under the Wyoming Commercial Attestation Act, a false attestation, even an unknowing one, is grounds for suspension of commercial licensing. If the mine's stated capacity is not what the document says it is, you can be held liable. She paused. "Did you read paragraph 4? He had. In general terms. Subsection C, she said. He had not fully processed subsection C. She looked at him for a long time. The expression on her face was not anger. It was something he found harder to meet than anger. It was the expression of a person who has been trying to protect something and has watched someone else walk into the perimeter and rearrange the defenses without asking whether that was what she wanted. "You were trying to help me," she said. "Yes," without asking me. He looked at her hands on the counter. They were still. That was the whole of his answer, and they both knew it. She stood. She went to the back room. She came back with the ledger she used for the shop's accounts, and also with a second book thicker and older that he had seen her reference occasionally but had never looked at closely. She set both on the counter. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the older book and turned it so it faced him. "My father kept this from the day he opened the shop," she said. "Every transaction, every customer, every supplier, every correspondence. I have continued it." She turned to a section near the middle of the book. "Look at this." He looked. The pages she had opened to showed columns of entries in two different hands. The first neat and slightly formal, which he took to be her father's. The second more compressed and more efficient, clearly hers. The entries ran across a period of nearly 2 years and documented in meticulous detail a pattern of commercial activity in Harrow's Gulch that told a story no single document could tell alone. The Turner family, the Hendricks family, the Okafor family, and 2 other names he recognized from overheard conversations in the saloon. Each one had a page or several pages of entries that chronicled small transactions, repairs, purchases, commissions. The ordinary commerce of a working shop with its customers, and for each one marked in her hand in the margin, a date. The date the land changed hands. She had been documenting it for 18 months. He looked up from the book. She said she had sent 3 letters to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. The first 2 through the Postal Service in Harrow's Gulch. No response. She paused. "Silas Vane's cousin runs the post office," she said. He absorbed this. "The 3rd letter went through you." He understood now why she had given him the envelope without asking what he intended to do with it and without telling him what was in it. She had known the letter would not be interfered with if it went through him, because no one in Harrow's Gulch would stop Wade Coulter from doing anything without a very clear plan for what happened next. "When I sent that letter," she said, "I did not know a response would come before the debt notice arrived. The debt notice was real. I could not pay it." She looked at him steadily. "What you did this morning was not nothing, but what you signed may create a problem as large as the one you solved." He sat with this, turned it over. "Tell me what you know about the mine," he said. She opened the ledger to a different section. "My father did harness and equipment work for the Vane mine operation for 11 years, she said. "He was paid consistently until about 2.5 years ago. Then the payments became irregular. Then they stopped. I have continued to do occasional repair work for the mine when they bring pieces in. The volume of that work has declined every season." She looked at him. "A mine operating at full capacity generates a consistent volume of equipment work," she said. "The work I am seeing tells me the operation has slowed significantly." He thought about the night shift men he had listened to that morning. The thinning vein, the flat pragmatism of people who have accepted a diagnosis. "If the mine is not operating at the capacity stated in that document," he said, "then the attestation is false," she said, "regardless of whether you intended it to be." He stood up from the chair. He walked to the window and looked out at the frozen street and the hard winter sky above it. He thought about the signature on that document and what it meant. He turned back. "The Federal Land Office," he said, "if your letter reached them." "A response would take time," she said. 2 weeks at minimum, perhaps more. "And the mine attestation. If someone files a complaint, the investigation begins immediately." He understood the shape of it now. He had signed something that gave Cornelia Vane a weapon she had not previously possessed. A weapon that could be turned against him if she chose to use it. His signature was insurance for her against interference. He had walked into the perimeter and handed the opposing position a tool. He looked at Nora. She was watching him work through it, and she was not saying anything, which was her version of patience. She did not move to fill silence when silence was doing useful work. "I should have asked you before I went to see her," he said. She said yes. He said he would not do that again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the counter and picked up both books and carried them back to the small writing desk in the back room and placed them in the locked drawer where she kept them. She came back to the main room. She sat at the bench. She picked up the awl. She said without looking up that she had a contact in Rawlins. A person who, if Wade were going there, she could write a letter of introduction for. Someone who knew the territory's land records. She also said something else. She said it carefully, the way a person says something they have decided to say after spending time deciding whether to say it. "There is a notary in Rawlins," she said. Retired now, but he was active through the territory in the early years. Fletcher Gaines. He notarized my father's original title registration on this property in 1874. He recorded everything. He has always recorded everything. If that documentation still exists and can be verified, the debt notice and any subsequent action becomes legally complicated for Vane to pursue. He looked at her. She said she had tried to find Gaines through the mail. No response. But she had reason to believe from a conversation her father had recorded in the ledger in 1878 that Gaines had settled in Rawlins, that he ran a small notary and record service on Center Street. Write it, he said. She said there was a storm coming Thursday. He said he knew. She said the pass would be open Friday morning if the storm cleared the way the pressure suggested. He said he would be ready at first light. She was quiet for a moment. The awl moved through the leather in its clean, controlled stroke. The sinew followed. The rhythm resumed. Then she said without inflection, without any particular weight on the words, though he understood that they had weight, that she could not pay him back for what he had done that morning. He said he knew. She said she would anyway. He said he knew that too. He sat in the chair by the stove. Outside, the wind had found a new angle and was pressing against the windows with a sound like something looking for a way in. The kerosene flames bent in their chimneys. The stove ticked and breathed. The awl moved. The sinew followed. He sat there until the light outside was fully gone, and the street beyond the window was nothing but cold and dark and the distant sound of the stamp mill winding down for the evening. Then he said good night, and she said good night. And he walked back to the hotel through the frozen street, and the lamp burned in the windows of Pruitt Leatherworks long after he was gone. He walked slowly. He was thinking about what it cost to keep going. He had always thought the cost was paid in solitude, in the absence of things, in the stripping away of need until what remained was lean and sufficient and required nothing from the world. He was beginning to think the real cost might be something different. The real cost might be all the years spent becoming very good at not needing anything until the not needing felt so much like strength that you forgot it was also a kind of loss. He was 38 years old. He had been paying that cost for a long time. In the hotel, he lay on his back in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. He thought about Friday morning and a pass through the mountains and a man named Fletcher Gaines in Rawlins who had witnessed a title registration years ago and might or might not have kept the records. He thought about the locked drawer in the back room and 18 months of work done alone. He thought about what it meant to stand beside something rather than in front of it. And then there was the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in the corner of his mind since the conversation in the leather shop, quiet and patient, waiting for him to look at it directly. She had said Gaines notarized the title registration in 1874. She had said she believed he had settled in Rawlins. But here was the thing Wade had not said out loud and had not yet fully examined. He had been to Rawlins. He had passed through twice in the last 3 years. He knew people there. He knew the terrain of the town and the names of the businesses on the main street and the general shape of who ran what and where. And somewhere in his memory of Rawlins, filed under things observed but not yet needed, was a name on a door on Center Street. A small office with a sign that said Gaines Records and Notary Services. He had walked past it twice without stopping because he had no reason to stop. He had reason now. He thought about the other thing he knew about Rawlins. The thing that had nothing to do with Fletcher Gaines and everything to do with 9 years he had been trying not to think about too directly. Ruth McKay. He had not thought of her in years, not deliberately. She surfaced sometimes the way things surface that you have pushed down far enough that you think they are gone, and then find they have only been resting. Ruth McKay had been the midwife who attended Clara's delivery, the only other person in the cabin that January night. He had not been there. He had gone for the doctor who was 2 days' ride away because Clara had insisted she was fine, and the baby was coming early, but not dangerously early, and there was time. There had not been time. He had come back to find Ruth waiting at the door. He had not let her finish what she was trying to tell him. He had seen her face and he had known, and he had walked past her into the cabin, and that was the last time he had spoken to anyone in Rawlins for 9 years. He had heard through the kind of information that travels in small territories whether you want it to or not, that Ruth McKay had moved to Rawlins about 5 years back, that she had retired from midwifery. that she was still alive. He had heard this and he had filed it under things that did not require any action on his part because there was nothing he deserved to hear that would make any of it different. That, too, was a choice. He had just never called it by its right name. He lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, and the wind had found the gaps around the window frame and was making a low sound that was not quite a whistle and not quite a moan, but something between the two. He thought about a small button the color of a faded afternoon sky. He thought about a woman in Rawlins who had been waiting 9 years to finish a sentence. He thought about a woman in a leather shop at the end of a frozen street who had been doing impossible work alone for 18 months and who had not once, not a single time in all the days he had sat in that chair by her stove, asked him to do anything for her that she had not already decided she wanted him to do. He closed his hand around the button in his pocket. He closed his eyes. Friday, he thought. First light. The storm came Thursday as predicted and left Friday as promised, and in its wake the world outside Harrow's Gulch was so white and still and absolute that it looked less like a landscape and more like a statement, the kind of statement that Wyoming winter made periodically to remind the people living in it that their presence was tolerated, not guaranteed. Wade was at the leather shop before first light. He had biscuits saddled and provisioned for 3 days, though he intended to make Rawlins in 2 if the pass cooperated. He had his ammunition, his bedroll, enough jerked meat and hardtack to see him through without needing to stop at the relay stations along the route. He knocked twice. The bolt slid back almost immediately. She had been awake for some time. He could tell from the lamp already burning at full height inside and the absence of that particular stillness that a room has when someone has only recently risen in it. She was dressed and aproned. Her hair was already pinned. In her hand she held an envelope sealed and addressed, and a folded piece of paper separate from the envelope. She handed him the envelope first. "This is for Fletcher Gaines," she said. "If he is in Rawlins, and if he is willing, he should write a notarized statement confirming the title registration for lots 14 and 15, Block C, witnessed in the fall of 1874. His notary seal from that period is sufficient. My letter explains the situation." He took the envelope. She handed him the folded paper. "This is his last known address, a hardware supplier on Center Street. That was several years ago." He put both items inside his coat. She looked at him in the pre-dawn dark with that clear, direct gaze. "Be careful on the north face of the pass," she said. "The new snow will be unstable over the old crust. Stay on the windward side of the trail." He said he knew the pass. She said she knew he did. A pause that was not uncomfortable. He said he would be back in 3 days. She nodded. She stepped back inside and closed the door, and he heard the bolt slide home, and he stood on the boardwalk in the cold for a moment, looking at the closed door and the lamp burning behind it. Then he turned and led Biscuit toward the edge of town and the white road beyond it. He was gone before the town woke up, and the lamp burned in the windows of Pruitt Leatherworks behind him, steady and undiminished, the way it had burned every morning for 18 months of careful solitary work that no one in this town had fully seen. Until now. The storm had left the world outside Harrow's Gulch flat and white and absolutely silent. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of weight. The kind that settles after a storm has said everything it intended to say and has nothing left to add. The drifts against the north-facing walls of the main street stood 6 feet high in places. The sky above them was the hard, pale blue of a cold that intends to stay. Nora opened the shop at first light the way she always did. She moved the wood Wade had stacked beside the door before he left, brought it in 2 armfuls at a time, fed the stove until it was breathing properly, and set the kettle on. She checked the work she had left mid-process on the bench the evening before. A bridal headstall half-assembled the tools laid out beside it in the order she would need them. She sat down. She picked up the awl. She worked for 2 hours before anyone came in. The first customer of the morning was a rancher's wife wanting a length of harness leather. The second was a boy from the livery with a stirrup leather that had cracked at the buckle hole. Nora repaired it while he waited, charged him 40 cents, and sent him back out into the cold. The shop was quiet again by mid-morning. She was at the bench working on the headstall when Reverend Elias Dodd pushed open the door. She knew him by the sound of his step before she looked up. 12 years of Sunday mornings had made his walk as familiar as the sound of the stamp mill or the wind finding the gap around the left window frame. He was a heavy man, and he carried his weight forward slightly ahead of himself, as though he was always just about to say something important. This morning, he came in differently. He came in the way a man comes into a place he knows he has no right to enter but is going to enter anyway because the alternative is to keep being who he has been, and he had run out of tolerance for that particular version of himself. He was not wearing his collar. He had the look of a man who had not slept. Not the ordinary sleeplessness of worry or cold, but the deeper kind that comes from spending a night with a decision you have been avoiding for a very long time and finally understanding that you cannot avoid it any longer. He did not sit down. He stood at the counter and he placed a folded piece of paper on the surface, and he kept his hand flat on top of it for a moment, as though he was not certain he could let go of it. Then he began to speak. He said that he knew Fletcher Gaines was in Rawlins, that he had known for 2 years, that he had known what it might mean for Nora. And he had said nothing because Cornelia Vane had done something for him a long time ago that he had told himself obligated his silence. She had paid the debt on the church building when the congregation could not. She had done it quietly without public acknowledgement, which had made it feel like generosity rather than leverage. It had taken him years to understand the difference, and by the time he understood it, he had already been silent for so long that breaking the silence felt like drowning. He said he had known Gaines from years back when Gaines had been the traveling notary working out of Rawlins through the territory. He said he had been present in the spring of 1878 when Gaines paid Thomas Pruitt for a set of harness leathers. He said Gaines had told him that afternoon that he had witnessed a title registration in Harrow's Gulch 4 years prior and that the documentation was as clean as any he had notarized in 30 years of practice. He said he had been sitting on that information for 2 years. His hand was still flat on the folded paper. "I cannot undo what I did not do," he said. "I can only stop doing it." He lifted his hand from the paper. He stepped back from the counter. He said that the paper had Gaines's current address, that a hardware supplier on Center Street had told him 2 years ago that Gaines had settled permanently in Rawlins, that if Wade Coulter went to Rawlins and found Gaines, the man would remember the registration and he would have the records. Then Dodd said one more thing. He said he had known Nora since she was 19 years old. He said he remembered the 4 months when she had not come to church when her father had been newly sick and she had not yet found her footing in what that meant. He said he had gone to visit her during that time and he had seen that she was not well, and he had helped her in the way that was available to him then to find her way back to herself. He said that after that, when Cornelia Vane had asked him about Nora and the shop and the land, he had told Cornelia that Nora was no one of particular consequence, a small business, a woman alone, not worth the trouble of attention. He said he had told himself he was protecting her by making her seem small. He said that was a lie he had told himself for 15 years. He stepped further back from the counter. He did not wait for her to speak. He did not look at her for absolution. He walked to the door and opened it and went out into the cold, and the door swung shut behind him, and the bell above it rang once and went still. Nora stood behind the counter. She looked at the folded paper. She did not move for a while. Dodd was the only person who had known her in that time, the only one who had come to the house, who had sat with her when sitting was all that was available, who had helped her find the thin thread back to herself when the thread had been very difficult to locate. She had not forgotten what he had done. She had carried it the way you carry a debt to someone you cannot repay. Now she understood that the debt had already been collected. It had been collected years ago, in a conversation she had not been present for, and the information withheld from a letter that never reached the people it was meant to reach. She did not feel anger. Anger required a kind of energy she had long since redirected toward things that could be changed. What she felt was something colder and more precise. The recognition that she had been carrying something alone that she had not needed to carry alone, and that the person who could have lightened it had chosen not to. Not out of cruelty, out of fear, which did not change what she had carried or how long she had carried it. She picked up the folded paper. She unfolded it. She read the address. Then she folded it again and placed it in the locked drawer in the back room next to the ledgers, next to the evidence she had spent 18 months building, next to everything she had built in silence, because silence was what she had been given to work with. She went back to the bench. She picked up the awl. She went back to work. Percy Vane came in 2 hours later. He came alone. He did not have the pleasant social manner he had deployed on previous visits, the easy smile and the careful friendliness of a young man who has learned to move through the world on the assumption that charm is a tool that opens most doors. He sat in the chair beside the stove without being invited. He sat in it the way a person sits in someone else's chair when they have decided that what they need to say matters more than the usual protocols. Nora kept working. She did not look up. Percy sat with his hat in his hands and turned it slowly. His hands were smooth, the hands of a man who had grown up with money and had never been required to do the kind of work that left permanent evidence on the skin. He said that his mother knew a federal man had come through Cheyenne asking questions about the Harrow's Gulch land transfers, that she knew it was connected to a letter filed from here, that she also knew Wade Coulter had left that morning for Rollins. She was going to file a complaint with the territorial court about the attestation document, he said. She was going to claim that Coulter had misrepresented his knowledge of the mine's operation in order to obtain a commercial advantage. It would not hold up permanently, he said, but it would freeze his commercial licenses while the investigation proceeded. 6 to 8 months. Nora set the awl down. She looked at Percy Vane. He did not look comfortable under that gaze. He shifted in the chair. He was, she had come to understand, a man who had been uncomfortable in chairs all his life because someone else had always been deciding which chair he sat in and for how long. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at his hands. He said he had been in the room 3 years ago when his mother had planned it. The whole scheme, Turner, Hendricks, Okafor, and the others. He had been standing right there, and he had listened, and he had said nothing, and he had helped where his mother needed helping. He said he had told himself she knew better than him, that she always had. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he had met Adayeze Okafor once, before he knew who she was, before he knew her family's name or what his mother intended. He had met her at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, and they had talked for perhaps 20 minutes about nothing of particular consequence, and he had thought she was a person worth knowing. 3 weeks later, he had stood in the doorway of his mother's office and helped compile the paperwork that forced her family off their land. He said he had not forgotten her face on the day her family loaded their wagon and left. He did not think he would forget it. He said he was 26 years old and he had never made a single decision in his life that he could look at straight. The stove breathed. Outside, a wagon passed on the frozen street, iron wheels shrieking against the ice. Nora said, "What do you want me to do with what you are telling me?" He said he wanted to know if there was a way out of this that did not require him to keep being what he had been. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it cost to keep going. She thought about 18 months of ledger entries and unanswered letters, and the particular arithmetic of people who do their own math and know exactly what they have and what they do not. She thought about what Dodd had said and what Percy was saying, and the difference between them, which was that Dodd had come after 15 years and Percy was here now. "There is one way," she said. She told him what it required. A federal investigator. Everything he knew, dates, conversations, documents, names, all of it. In exchange for his cooperation, the investigator might offer him immunity from prosecution. She said might. She said she was not the investigator and she could not promise anything. Percy said, "And if I do this, what happens to her?" Nora said that depended on what he told them and what they found. He was quiet. He looked at his hands again. He looked at the stove. He looked at the finished work hanging on the rack along the right wall, the saddle and the scabbard, and the set of harness with the tooled border pattern she had been working on for 3 weeks. She said his name. She said she was not asking him to do anything. He had come to her. He had told her he wanted to look at something straight. This was the straight version of it. Everything else was still crooked. He sat in the chair for another minute. Then he stood up. He put his hat on. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around that his mother was not a bad person. She had just decided a long time ago that losing things was the worst thing that could happen, and then spent the rest of her life proving herself right. He went out into the cold. Nora sat at her bench for a long time after he left. She thought about what he had said. She thought about people who decide early that loss is the worst possible outcome, and how that decision made young and held tightly enough tends to become a self-fulfilling document, signed and witnessed and filed with whatever force governs the way people move through the world. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she stood and went back to the bench. Cornelia Vane came herself that afternoon. She did not send Percy. She did not send a letter or a legal notice or a representative. She came through the front door of Pruitt Leatherworks in her good wool coat with the fur collar, and she stood before the counter, and she looked at Nora Pruitt with an expression that was entirely unguarded for perhaps the first time in many years. Because she was a woman who had just discovered that her son had gone somewhere she had not authorized him to go and had done something she had not anticipated, and she did not yet know precisely what, and she had come here because this was where the answer was. She looked around the shop, at the tools on the walls, at the finished work on the rack, at the bench with its lamp and its vise and its ordered rows of implements, at the two small windows with the frost on the outside of the glass and the warm yellow light on the inside. She looked at all of it in a way Nora had not been looked at before. Not with contempt, not with the calculating attention of someone pricing a property. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find. She said, "You did all of this yourself, after your father died?" Nora said yes. She said, "How old were you?" 24, Nora said. Cornelia was quiet for a moment. She set her gloves on the counter. A small gesture. The gesture of a woman settling in for a conversation rather than a transaction. Then she said she was going to tell Nora something she had not told anyone because it no longer mattered who knew it and because she was tired of the weight of it. The mine was not viable. It had not been viable for 2 years. There was no new vein. There was no capital investment that would change that. The ore was gone. She said her husband had built that mine with 20 years of his life. That every man in that town who had ever worked for wages had worked for him at some point. That when he died she had told herself the mine dying with him was not acceptable. That there had to be a way to preserve what he had built. There was not, she said. I was wrong. And in being wrong I did things that cannot be undone. Nora said the names. Turner, Hendricks, Okafor. Cornelia did not flinch. Yes, she said. Nora asked what she had intended to do with the land. The territorial resurvey, Cornelia said. When it comes through, consolidated corner properties in an established town site are worth 3 times their current value. I intended to sell, take the proceeds, leave before anyone understood what had happened. She looked at Nora. I intended to disappear, she said, before anyone connected the events. The stove ticked. The lamp burned. Nora said, "And now?" Cornelia looked at her with an expression that was very simply exhausted. The exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has arrived at the moment of setting it down. Not because she has chosen to, not entirely, but because her arms have given out. She said Percy had come home that morning. She said she had looked at his face when he came in and had seen something there she had not seen before in 26 years of looking at it. Something that looked like a person who had made a decision that was his own. She said she was not willing to be the thing that took that away from him. She would withdraw the attestation complaint against Wade Coulter before it was filed. She would make available to the federal investigator whatever documentation he required regarding the land transfers. She paused. I am not doing this because I believe it is right, she said. I am doing it because of Percy. I want you to understand the distinction. She picked up her gloves. She turned them over in her hands. She did not say anything further. She did not offer any more explanation or justification or apology. She put her gloves on. She walked to the door. She pushed it open and went out into the cold without looking back, and the door swung shut behind her. Nora stood behind the counter. She looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then she went to the back room and unlocked the drawer and took out the ledger and the older book that had been her father's. She sat at the small desk and she opened the older book to the last entry her father had made before he became too sick to write. The handwriting was uneven, the letters struggling, the hand of a man doing something that had become physically difficult, but that he was determined to complete. The entry was a simple one, a transaction, a repair job for a man named Gaines, a set of harness leathers completed and delivered, paid in full. The date was March of 1878, 2 months before her father died. She looked at the name for a long time. Her father had written it, in his own hand. With the care he brought to every entry, even at the end, even when the care cost him more than it once had. Gaines had been in this shop, had sat where her customers sat, had watched her father work, had paid for work done well, and had said, according to Dodd, that the title registration he had witnessed here 4 years before, that was as clean as any he had notarized in 30 years of practice. Her father had written it all down. He had always written everything down. She closed the book, locked the drawer, went back to the bench. She had work to do. She always had work to do. The work did not stop because the world was complicated, and it did not stop because people were exhausting, and it did not stop because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the particular fatigue of a person who has been doing something alone for a long time. She picked up the awl. She went back to work. Nora heard Biscuit before she saw anything. The old mule's hooves on the frozen street had a weight and rhythm she had catalogued without meaning to over the past 3 weeks. Heavier than a horse, more deliberate. Each step settled fully before the next one began. She had memorized that sound from inside a closed building with the wind working at the windows without deciding to memorize it. It had simply deposited itself in her the way certain things do without asking permission. She did not go to the door. She stayed at the bench. She heard Wade tie Biscuit at the rail outside. She heard his boots on the boardwalk, 3 heavy regular strikes of a man who walks with his full weight on the ground. She had heard those boots on that boardwalk every morning and most evenings for 3 weeks, and she knew them the way she knew the sound of her own tools. The door opened. Cold came in with him. He was snow-covered and trail-worn, and he had the particular look of a man who has ridden hard because he had reason to. She had not seen that expression on him before, and it told her something had changed before he said a word. He reached into his coat. He put an envelope on the counter. He said that Fletcher Gaines remembered her father, that he remembered the registration, that he had his original notary ledger from 1874 intact, because he was the kind of man who keeps things intact and has never seen a reason to stop. He said he had read her letter to Gaines that first evening, that Gaines had the affidavit written and witnessed by noon the following day, that there was nothing left to wait for. He nodded at the envelope. Notarized statement, he said, confirming the original title registration for lots 14 and 15, Block C, Harrow's Gulch, in the name of Thomas Arthur Pruitt. Free and clear, no encumbrances. Witnessed, sealed, and signed before 2 additional witnesses at the Rawlins courthouse. She looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up immediately. There is more, he said. She looked at him. A federal investigator named August Ree arrived in Rawlins the morning I got there. He had your letter. He was already preparing to come to Harrow's Gulch. We rode back together. She said the name, Ree. He said it was on a document tube on her shelf. He said Ree was at the hotel now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him everything that had happened while he was gone. She told him about Dodd. She told him about Percy. She told him about Cornelia coming herself in her wool coat with the fur collar and standing in the shop and looking at the tools on the walls as though she was seeing them for the first time. She told him what Cornelia had said about the mine and about Percy and about the attestation complaint she intended to withdraw. She told him all of it without embellishment and without interpretation, the way she recorded things in the ledger, fact by fact, in the order they occurred. He listened to all of it without interrupting, with the full weight of his attention and without any apparent need to redirect or correct or impose his own understanding on what he was hearing. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He said that if Cornelia had admitted the mine was not operating at the stated capacity, the attestation document was a false statement, regardless of what he had known when he signed it. That Ree could use that. She said she knew. He said her ledger was the backbone of the case. 18 months of documented transactions across every affected property, that Ree would need it authenticated and submitted before the territorial court could be petitioned, that she would need to testify. She said she knew that too. He said it would not be comfortable. She said that very little worth doing was. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved through his face that she had not seen before. Not a smile, something quieter than a smile. A slight easing of the controlled gravity that he wore as his normal expression, the expression of a man who has spent 9 years being careful about what he allowed himself to feel in the presence of other people. It was there and then it was gone. But she saw it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. The meeting with August Ree took place in the back room of the leather shop because Nora would not go to a public building for it, and because Ree, who was a practical man who had been doing this work for 16 years and understood that getting what he needed required meeting people where they were willing to be met, agreed without argument. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a face that forgot itself in a crowd, careful eyes, a methodical manner. He set his leather case on the small desk and opened it with the practiced efficiency of a man who has opened it in many back rooms, in many difficult places, and has learned to take none of them for granted. He looked at the ledger for a long time. He asked questions and Nora answered them. Wade sat in the corner and said nothing unless Ree addressed him directly, which he did twice. Once about the timeline of the attestation signing, and once about the conversation with the night shift workers in the saloon. Both times, Wade answered in the precise, unembellished language of a man who understands that accuracy is more useful than impression. When Ree had finished his questions and had worked through both volumes of the ledger and had made his notes in the careful hand of a man who trusts documentation more than memory, he looked up. He said that the documentation was the most comprehensive record of a systematic land acquisition scheme he had seen in 16 years of territorial investigation. He said, "You did this alone." Nora said yes. He said over 18 months. She said yes. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the ledger. He did not say anything further about it, which was the right response, and she noted that he understood it was the right response. He laid out what would happen next. The ledger would go with him for the federal filing. She would receive a receipt. The original would be returned when the case concluded. He would need her testimony before the territorial magistrate in Cheyenne within the next 3 weeks. He looked at her. "Can you do that?" She said yes. He turned to Wade. The attestation document, he said, given Mrs. Vane's own admission, now documented in his preliminary notes that the mine was not operating at the stated capacity, put the false attestation on Vane, not on Wade. He said he was recommending to the district attorney that no action be taken against him. He said Wade might want to have a lawyer review the original document regardless. Wade said he would do that. Ree reached into his leather case and removed a folded document. He set it on the desk. The Gaines affidavit, he said, combined with the original land office filing that they had located in the Cheyenne records, was conclusive regarding title. The property was hers. The debt notice had been an attempt to leverage a real debt against an unencumbered title, which was fraud on its face once the affidavit was entered. "No court in the territory," he said, "will uphold any claim against this property." The room was quiet. Nora looked at the folded document. She said the other families: Turner, Hendricks, Okafor. Ree said that if their transfers could be demonstrated to have occurred under similar coercive circumstances, and the ledger suggested they could, there would be a restitution process as part of the settlement. He said he could not promise outcomes. He could promise the process would happen. She nodded slowly. He packed his case. He shook her hand. He shook Wade's hand. He said he would be in Harrow's Gulch for 2 more days before returning to Cheyenne. He left. The leather shop was very quiet. Nora sat down at her bench. Not to work, just to sit, which was something she almost never did. She put her hands flat on the surface of the workbench and she looked at them. Large hands, scarred, stained deep into the skin in the creases around the knuckles where the dye went and stayed regardless of how thoroughly she cleaned them. The hands of 10 years of work done in this room. The hands of a woman who had learned that the work was the one thing that did not require anything from her except her attention and her skill and her willingness to show up every morning and be present for it. She thought about her father making his last entry in the ledger in the uneven handwriting of a man who was dying, but who was finishing what he had started, because that was who he was, and because that was who he had made her. Wade sat in his chair by the stove. He had come to understand over the past 3 weeks the difference between a silence that wanted company and a silence that wanted witness. She did not need him to say anything. She needed him to stay. He stayed. He turned the piece of cedar he had been working on in his hands. A simple shape, no particular design, just his hands and the knife moving through the wood with the patient attention of a man who has learned to do things slowly enough to do them right. After a while, she said 18 months. He said he knew. She said she had not known if anyone would ever look at it. He said someone looked at it. She said, "Because you sent the letter." He said, "She wrote the letter. He just carried it." She said, "You carried it to Rollins." He said that was still just carrying. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. His profile in the lamplight was the profile of a man who means what he says and says what he means, and has no particular interest in the space between those two things. She said his name. He looked at her. She said, "Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The small, definitive nod of a man who has received something he was not sure he deserved and is not going to make a production of it. The stove breathed. The lamp burned. Outside, the last gray light of the winter afternoon was failing against the hard blue of the oncoming night. She said there was something she wanted to tell him. He said, "All right." She looked at her hands on the bench. She said that when she was 19, her father was in his first year of being sick. Not the worst of it yet, but the beginning. She had not known it was the beginning. She had thought it was everything. She said she had thought that watching him grow smaller and knowing she could not stop it was the worst thing she was going to feel, and she could not see past it. She stopped. He waited. She said there was a period of about 4 months when she was not careful about her own life, in the way that people are sometimes not careful when they cannot see past something. She looked at her left arm. She did not pull up the sleeve. She did not need to. They both knew what was there. She said she was not telling him because she needed him to do anything about it. She was telling him because he had been in that room with her for 3 weeks, and he had not asked. And she thought he deserved to know that she had seen what he looked like when he looked away. He was very still. She said she was not that person now, had not been for a long time. But that person was part of how she had become who she was, and who she was had no shame in it. She looked up at him. She said she wanted him to know that she knew he had seen, and that she knew what he had done with what he saw. He looked at her, took his time with it. He said, "What did I do with it?" She said, "You sat in the chair by the stove and you were exactly what you had been." He said that was all he knew how to do. She said it was enough. He looked at the stove for a moment. Then he said he had something in his coat pocket that he had been carrying for 9 years. She said she knew. He looked at her. She said she had seen it once by accident. She had not read it. She had seen the shape of it and the way he reached for it sometimes, without seeming to know he was doing it. She said she was sorry about what he had lost. He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. A log shifted inside it and sent a small shower of sparks against the iron door. He said his wife's name had been Clara. She said she knew. He said he had gone up the mountain the fall after she died, and he had not really come back down. Not all the way. Not until this year. She asked what had changed. He said he did not know exactly. He said he had woken up one morning and the silence had a different quality. It had always been the thing he went up there for. That fall, it was just quiet. Empty quiet, not the other kind. She said there were 2 kinds. He said yes. She said she knew them both. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamplight was warm and steady between them, and outside the Wyoming winter was conducting its usual business of being vast and cold and indifferent to human arrangements, but it was outside. And in here the stove breathed and the lamp burned and the smell of leather and beeswax and honest work had soaked into the walls over years and years of a family doing what needed to be done. He reached into his coat. He brought out a small button. Blue, or what had once been blue, faded now at the edges from 9 years of being carried. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the workbench between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said he had been carrying it because he did not know where else to put it. A tent was not a place. A mountain was not a place. He looked at the button. "I need it to be somewhere that is actually somewhere," he said. She was quiet. She looked at the button lying on the surface of the bench where she had done the work of her life, among the tools her father had left her, in the room that a federal investigator had just confirmed belonged to her and to no one else and could not be taken. She said she had a frame, a small one. Her father had made it for a photograph that was lost. It had been empty since. She got up from her stool. She went to the back room and came back with a small wooden frame. Simple hand-fitted at the corners, sanded smooth and oiled. She set it on the bench beside the button. She said, "If you want." He looked at the frame. He looked at the button. He looked at her. He said yes. She picked up the button carefully, the way she picked up everything she worked with full attention and no wasted motion. She fitted it into the center of the frame and pressed the backing into place. She turned it over and looked at it for a moment. The small blue button, faded, carried, real. Then she walked to the east wall of the shop, the wall that caught the morning light first when the sun came up over the eastern hills, the brightest wall in the room. She held the frame against the wall in several places. She chose the one she wanted. There was a small nail already in the wall there. A nail she had put in years ago for a purpose she no longer remembered. She hung the frame on it. She stepped back. A small blue button and a small wooden frame on a wall in a leather shop in Wyoming. On the wall that got the light first. She heard Wade stand up from the chair. She heard him come to stand beside her. He was a large man and she was not a small woman, and together they took up a significant portion of the available space. She found that in this moment, not crowding, but something else entirely, something for which she did not have an immediate word. He stood beside her and looked at the frame on the wall and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "That was a good wall." She said, "It gets the light." He said he could see that. Outside, someone was driving a wagon down the main street, the iron wheels on the ice. A door somewhere opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a town conducting its ordinary business on an ordinary winter evening. And then there was the other thing Wade had not yet said, the thing he had carried back from Rawlins in addition to the Gaines affidavit and the return of August Rhee. He said that when he was in Rawlins he had asked Gaines about something. About a woman named Ruth Mackay. Nora looked at him. He said Ruth Mackay had been the midwife who attended his wife's delivery, that she had been the only other person there, that he had not spoken to her since the night Clara died, that he had heard she had moved to Rawlins some years back. He said Gaines had known her for years, and that Gaines had told him on the second evening after the affidavit was done, and they were sitting with coffee by Gaines's stove, that Ruth Mackay had said something to Gaines once years back about a woman she had attended in 1870, a woman who had died in labor, a woman who had said something in her final minutes meant for her husband, and Ruth had kept it because that is what you do with something that belongs to someone else. You keep it until the person it belongs to comes to collect it. The room was very still. Nora said she still has it. He said yes. She said, "Are you going to go?" He looked at the frame on the wall, the small button, the wall that got the light first. He said he thought he was. He said he thought he had not gone before because he had not believed he deserved to hear anything that might make the carrying easier. He said he understood now that the not going had been its own kind of choice, the kind that feels like strength and is actually just a longer way of being afraid. He said he thought he would ride to Rawlins in the spring when the pass opened properly. She said that was a good idea. He said, "I want to come back." She looked at him. He said after Rawlins, "I want to come back here." She was quiet for a moment in the way that she was quiet, which was not the absence of something, but the presence of a person taking the full measure of what was in front of them before they spoke. Because when she spoke, it meant something. Because she had learned very early and very well the difference between words that cost nothing and words that cost everything. She said yes. He said yes. She said yes. Outside, Biscuit was tied at the rail at the end of the street, presumably waiting for someone to remember that he existed, which was a role he had been filling for 7 years with characteristic patience and minimum drama. The sign above the door said what it said. Pruitt Leather Works, established 1874. The lamp burned. The stove breathed. The small blue button caught the last of the lamplight on the east wall and held it the way things hold on to light when the dark is coming in. That was enough. That was exactly enough.